So today we're going to talk about Invisible Cities by the Italian writer Italo Calvino. Invisible Cities first came out in Italian in 1972 and is one of the most popular novels by Italo Calvino. Invisible Cities was also one of the very first books I reviewed here on this channel, but you won't find that old review anymore. Instead, you'll have this one, which, trust me, is a lot better. Now, if you watch my weekly book reviews, if you've been watching them recently, you probably know by now that the structure I follow is always more or less the same. I begin by talking about the author, but I only tend to highlight those aspects of the author's biography that I think are key to understanding the book I'm reviewing. Then I give you a few relevant aspects of the context in which the book was written, and finally, I dive deep into the book itself, but I always avoid any plot spoilers. In fact, I try to talk about the plot of books I review as little as possible. Well, my review of Invisible Cities is not going to be the exception, so let me begin by telling you a little bit about its author, Italo Calvino. Italo Calvino was born in Cuba in 1923. Both his parents were Italian botanists who were working in that Caribbean island nation, but only 2 years after his birth, in 1935, the whole family moved to Italy. The Calvinos were fiercely anti-fascist, so at the outbreak of World War II, when Italo Calvino was a university student, he joined the Italian resistance, encouraged by his mother. Because Italo had refused to conscript, his parents were held hostage for quite some time. Now, his parents' suffering during the war is something that had a profound effect on Italo Calvino. After the war, he moved to Turin, and instead of resuming his studies in agriculture that he had begun before the war, he enrolled in arts. Italo Calvino's master's thesis is on Joseph Conrad, author among other books of Heart of Darkness, as you know. At that time, in the second half of the 1940s, Italo Calvino writes about his experience in the resistance in books such as his first novel, The Path to the Nest of Spiders, published in 1947. Also that year, he joins the Italian Communist Party, although he left the party 10 years later, in 1957, after the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. From the beginning, Calvino writes novels and essays, so he quickly becomes one of the most important intellectual figures in Italy after the war. During that post-war period, Calvino works in a publishing house, in a big publishing house, Einaudi, and there he meets other writers such as Natalia Ginzburg or Cesare Pavese. Also, during that period, he travels to the United States, and New York City particularly makes a profound impact on him. Later, he also lived in Paris, and I mention these two cities because I think they and other big cities he must have visited, I think had an impact and inspired him to write the book we're discussing today. Now, Calvino lived in Paris, as I said, and he lived there for about 10 years in the 50s and 60s. And I think Paris also influenced his writing, not just the city, but also being in contact with the French writers of that time. While his earlier novels, before he moved to Paris, were realist, or perhaps influenced by Italian cinema, neo-realist, his style changes in the 60s and 70s. And this is something that makes Calvino hard to classify as a fiction writer. I have only read books by him from that later period, so the Calvino I know is most definitely not a realist writer. One of the most fascinating aspects of Calvino's writing is his engagement to fantasy, to the fantastical, and even the magical, and also his need for mathematical order, which we can see in the structure of his novels, particularly in Invisible Cities. Now, Italo Calvino is not just a fiction writer who produced fiction, he's also an intellectual essayist who thinks about writing fiction and reflects on it on his non-fiction. His non-fiction production originally came out in different magazines, very fragmentarily, but eventually it was published in a collected book format. Italo Calvino is engaged in the cultural reconstruction of Italy after World War II. For instance, he collected 200 tales from around the country, which he then translated into standard Italian and published as Italian folk tales in 1956. In the 1950s, Italo Calvino writes what he'll eventually refer to as the Heraldic Trilogy. The three novels are The Cloven Viscount from 1952, The Baron in the Trees from 1957, The Non-Existent Knight from 59, and if you have never read anything by Calvino, you need to know that he is a highly experimental writer, so you shouldn't judge his writing based on one or two of his books alone, because it's always different. But if there is a common element to his writing, I would say that's simplicity. Yes, Calvino is experimental, but his writing is never difficult to read. Of course, as with all great writers, that simplicity is only ostensive. So, before we get into Invisible Cities, I think there were two other collections of short stories, Marco Valdo, which came out in '63, and Cosmic Comics from '65. Okay, now let's get into Invisible Cities now. And what a book it is. If you have never read anything by Calvino and you don't know where to begin, I would strongly suggest you pick up Invisible Cities. It's so much fun to read and so mind-blowing. And if you don't own a copy already, you will find a link to it and all the other books by Italo Calvino available in English translation in the description box for this video. So, what is an invisible city? Can there be cities that we cannot see? How would we know there are if we cannot see them? And where are they? Of course, those invisible cities only exist in the narrator's imagination. But as experimental and original as Invisible Cities is, it draws from the Italian literary tradition. Calvino was inspired also by a 13th century book, The Travels of Marco Polo, which is a travelogue that describes the wonders the Venetian explorer Marco Polo saw during his travels through Asia. Invisible Cities has Marco Polo having a series of conversations with the emperor of the Mongol Empire, Kublai Khan. Now, Marco Polo had become a diplomat in the court of Kublai Khan, and in Invisible Cities, he tells the emperor about all the amazing cities he has seen in his travels. In total, Marco Polo talks about 55 different cities. The book is divided into 9 chapters and has a complex but highly logical internal structure. Now, the 55 cities are grouped thematically. There are 11 groups in total: cities and memory, cities and desire, cities and signs, thin cities, trading cities, cities and eyes, cities and names, cities and the dead, cities and the sky, continuous cities, and hidden cities. The first and the last chapters cover 10 cities each, and all the chapters in between cover 5 cities each. Now, remember what I said about Calvino's mathematical order? Well, it's all here in this novel. I think Invisible Cities is one of the clearest examples of this specific characteristic of Calvino's fiction, the need for mathematical order. So the book is framed as a series of conversations, as I say, between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan. In each of these conversations, Marco Polo describes the 55 cities for the emperor. There is a beginning and an ending to each of those conversations, and that's also how the chapters are structured internally. Now, Calvino is not inventing anything in terms of structure here, because the way he builds the chapters is something that actually belongs to the Italian literary tradition. The best example of this, I think, would be the Decameron by Boccaccio, in which, as you probably know, a group of young people, they all tell each other a tale, so they all tell each other tales, and they're doing this as a distraction while they are sheltering, trying to escape the Black Death. One of the most fascinating aspects of Invisible Cities is how Calvino is in dialogue with his literary tradition, in fact. But I don't want to give you the wrong impression, that you need to be well read in Italian classics to enjoy Invisible Cities, because I don't think that's true. And if that were the case, I don't think Invisible Cities would be as popular as it is, would it? Okay, I think I really do think that anyone, no matter what they have read before, could enjoy Invisible Cities. In fact, Invisible Cities is one of the very, very few books that I would recommend to any reader, no matter what their taste or background was. Now, Invisible Cities, I think, is also an endless book, meaning that you can read it over and over again, and you would always notice something new. All the cities in the book have female names, and I won't mention all 55 of them, of course, but just to give you an idea of the names, there are cities named Smeralda, Phyllis, Moriana, Melania, Chloe, Zoe, Cecilia, and so on. So, have you read Invisible Cities? Let me know in the comment section below. This is all from me. I hope to see you again very soon for another book review. Bye for now.